Take away the marble, satisfies, and classroom legends, and something ugly appears. There is no heroic music, no noble charge across an open field. There is only the heat of a plain filled with bodies, the crackle of fires, and veterans who flinch when one man walks past. For 2,000 years, people have called him a genius, a dreamer, a champion of civilization. But the men who drank with him, marched with him, and watched him kill on a whim did not see a liberator. They saw a violent addict to power who treated human life as disposable. Strip away the bronze busts and the textbook glory, and what's left is something repulsive. No swelling soundtrack, no valiant cavalry thundering across a golden horizon. Just the stench of a scorched valley carpeted with the dead, embers still glowing, and hardened soldiers who go silent the moment one man rides by. 23 centuries of praise have painted him as a visionary, a liberator, a torch-bearer of progress. But the soldiers who shared his tent, bled beside him, and watched him execute men over a glance told a very different story. They did not see a savior. They saw an addict dressed in armor, feeding on conquest the way other men feed on air. Throw out every painting of the golden warrior king. Alexander of Macedon did not lead an empire. He ran a military cartel with an infinite supply of bodies. His court was not a government. It was a cult held together by fear and spectacle. He forced generals to call him a god. He humiliated allies in front of thousands for sport. One wrong sentence at his table could end with a blade buried in your ribs before your cup hit the floor. One refusal to bow could mean being lashed to a horse and dragged across gravel until there was nothing left to bury. This was not leadership. This was one man using a crown as a weapon of personal terror. In this video, we are going to dismantle every layer of that myth. We will step inside the sealed chambers where blood relatives disappeared without explanation, hear the coerced confessions beaten out of his most trusted commanders, and walk through the smoking ruins of cities he leveled just to prove no one could touch him. You will watch how a single fractured mind warped armies, crushed nations, and devoured entire civilizations to feed his paranoia, then left behind nothing but dust and decades of civil war. Before we go any further, drop a comment telling me what city and country you are watching from right now, and take 1 second to subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. You are watching Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world. The most lethal position in the ancient world was never standing across a battlefield from Alexander. It was standing next to him. His enemies at least had the mercy of a quick death on open ground. His friends died slowly, strangled by accusations fabricated over wine, surrounded by men too terrified to speak. Long before he reduced foreign cities to rubble, he perfected his cruelty on the people closest to him. His first conquest was not Persia. It was his own bloodline. Picture the scene. AG 336 BC. Philip of Macedon sits at the peak of everything a king could want. He has broken the spine of every Greek rival, forged the deadliest fighting force the world has ever seen, and is months away from launching a full invasion of the Persian Empire. On this particular morning, he strolls into an open theater for a royal wedding celebration. There is music. There are cheering crowds. There are soldiers lining the walkway in polished armor. Philip walks in wearing ceremonial robes, no weapon on his belt, no shield on his arm. And somewhere in that audience, watching from the margins, stands his teenage son, Alexander, quietly suffocating under the weight of a question he cannot ignore. Am I still the heir? Philip is taking a new bride, Cleopatra Eurydice, young, Macedonian to her bones, and politically devastating. This marriage is not romance. It is a loaded weapon aimed directly at Alexander's future. If this woman produces a son, that child will carry pure Macedonian blood on both sides. Alexander, born to Olympias, a foreign princess from Epirus, instantly drops from crown prince to expendable spare. At the wedding feast, a drunken nobleman has already raised his cup and toasted the hope of a legitimate heir, spitting the word like venom in Alexander's direction. Olympias has stormed out of the kingdom entirely. The royal household is not a family anymore. It is a fuse burning towards something no one can stop. And then the explosion comes. Philip steps between his personal guards, walking proudly into the open theater. Out of the crowd, a man named Pausanias surges forward. One thrust of a dagger. The king of Macedon drops in front of hundreds of witnesses. Screaming erupts. Soldiers scramble. Pausanias bolts for the exit, but never makes it. The guards run him down and kill him on the spot, before anyone can ask him a single question. The most powerful ruler in all of Greece bleeds out on a stone floor, on a day designed to celebrate his dominance. The official version is almost insultingly tidy. Pausanias had a personal grudge, an old humiliation that festered until it turned lethal. Case closed. But even historians writing decades later could not swallow that story whole. Why was the gap between Philip's bodyguards wide enough for a lone attacker to walk through? Why was the assassin silenced immediately instead of captured alive? Ancient sources whispered what no one dared say out loud, that Olympias, and perhaps Alexander himself, had engineered the entire thing, using Pausanias as a disposable blade. No courtroom would convict on what survives, but what unfolded in the hours after Philip's murder looks less like grief and more like a schedule being executed on time. Alexander moved before the blood was dry. He was barely 20 years old. No crown had touched his head. No ceremony had made him king. But he understood one law that ruled Macedon above all others. If you hesitate, you die. Rival claimants in this kingdom did not get voted out. They got buried. Alexander seized the army and locked down every nobleman who mattered before the sun set. The veterans who had spent their lives following Philip now stared at his young son and made a calculation. Back him or face a war, no one would win. They chose survival. They gave him their swords. Then the purge began. Philip had left behind other wives, other children, other bloodlines that could be weaponized against the new king. In a modern crime film, this is the sequence where car doors open in dark parking lots and loose ends stop breathing. In Macedon, it happened in palaces. Cleopatra Eurydice and her newborn child vanish from the historical record with disturbing speed. Later accounts point the finger at Olympias, claiming she had them killed in ways too savage to repeat here. Whether Alexander gave the order, nodded his approval, or simply turned his back, the outcome was identical. An entire rival branch of the family tree, cut at the root. Other potential claimants, like Philip's son Caranus, surface in the sources only long enough to be reported dead. Every thread that could unravel Alexander's claim was snipped clean. One relative does survive. Aridaeus, Alexander's half-brother, later called Philip III, but Aridaeus is mentally impaired, possibly the result of a poisoning years earlier that some ancient writers blamed on Olympias herself. Whatever the truth, he poses zero threat. He will spend years as a figurehead, a name dragged out by warlords after Alexander's death, whenever they need a puppet on a leash. His survival proves the cold arithmetic at work. Anyone capable of challenging the throne is destroyed. Anyone too weak to matter is kept alive and used. This is not a peaceful transfer of power. This is a hostile takeover disguised as inheritance. Men who served Philip loyally find themselves suddenly accused of disloyalty, pressured until they either fall on their own swords or disappear without explanation. The signal ripples through every corridor in the kingdom. The new king did not simply inherit the throne. He is the one still breathing when everyone else is not. From his very first day, Alexander governs through terror. When he finally marches east to invade the Persian Empire, he does not leave behind a grateful homeland. He leaves behind a court paralyzed by what it has witnessed. His mother Olympias operates like a queen and a warlord simultaneously, crushing enemies back home while her son burns his way across Asia. Anyone who remembers a time when Philip held the power and Alexander was just a boy waiting his turn now buries that memory deep. The past in Macedon has been rewritten, and the first draft was signed in a dead king's blood on a theater floor. On the surface, the Persian campaign reads like pure triumph. The river crossing at Granicus, the rout at Issus, the masterpiece at Gaugamela, Darius III running, Persian governors surrendering. But inside Alexander's inner circle, a second and far darker campaign is taking shape. The construction of a cult around one man. Each victory makes him harder to question. Each fallen city makes his word feel less like opinion and more like divine decree. Officers who once wrestled with him as boys now weigh every syllable before they open their mouths. In the early campaigns, traces of the old brotherhood still flicker. They drink together after a siege. They swap childhood memories around a fire. But something behind Alexander's eyes has changed. He drinks more than any man in camp. His moods swing from euphoria to ice-cold rage without warning. He catalogues every insult, every sideways glance, every moment of insufficient praise. And when he feels slighted, he does not debate. He destroys. Then comes the next phase of his transformation, and it is calculated to the last detail. After shattering the Persian military and seizing palaces filled with gold, Alexander decides that being the most powerful king alive is not enough. He wants to be worshipped. In the Persian court, there exists a ritual called proskynesis, a deep physical bow, sometimes forehead to the ground, performed before the great king. For Persians, it is a gesture of political respect. For Greeks and Macedonians, that kind of prostration belongs to the gods and no one else. Alexander imports this ritual into his own court. He frames it as cultural diplomacy, a bridge between conqueror and conquered. But what it actually is a loyalty test wrapped in humiliation. He is commanding battle-scarred veterans, men who marched through deserts and bled in the front line, to drop to the ground in front of a man they once arm-wrestled as teenagers. He is demanding that free men perform an act that, in their own culture, means surrendering their dignity to something more than human. Feel the tension in that room. The Persian nobles comply without hesitation. They bow, they touch the floor. They address him in tones reserved for something close to a deity. But when the moment arrives for the Macedonians, the air turns thick. These are men who have seen Alexander doubled over with dysentery, screaming in pain from a wound, stumbling drunk out of a tent. They know exactly how mortal he is, but the room is lined with armed guards, and the king is watching. Some submit. They press their foreheads to the stone and bury their pride rather than gamble with their lives. Others cannot stomach it. One man in particular draws a line. Callisthenes, the court historian, a relative of Aristotle himself, raised in a tradition that holds free speech sacred, refuses to kneel before any mortal. His defiance becomes the most talked-about moment in camp. Alexander's experiment with forced worship collapses in public embarrassment. But Alexander never forgets a humiliation. Callisthenes will later be arrested on thin conspiracy charges and will die in captivity. Broken and silenced. This episode is a window into how Alexander's mind processes loyalty. Battlefield courage is not enough. Winning wars is not enough. He needs psychological submission. He needs every man around him to accept, publicly and physically, that Alexander exists on a plane above ordinary judgment, closer to the gods than to the soldiers standing beside him. Anyone who resists that idea is not simply a critic. He is a threat. And threats in Alexander's orbit have a very short shelf life. No one illustrates this more brutally than the fate of the man who helped make Alexander king in the first place, Parmenion. This is not some minor officer. Parmenion is the senior general of the entire Macedonian army, a veteran who served Philip before Alexander could hold a sword, a commander who had already defeated Persian troops in Asia Minor before Alexander ever set foot on foreign soil. His experience, his reputation, his network of loyalty among the officer corps make him the single most important military figure in the empire after Alexander himself. Parmenion's son, Philotas, holds one of the most prestigious commands in the army: leadership of the companion cavalry, the elite strike force that rides at Alexander's side in every major engagement. Philotas is talented, decorated, and deeply respected. He is also proud, and in Alexander's evolving court, pride without constant flattery is starting to look like rebellion. As the campaign pushes deeper into Asia, the temperature between Philotas and the king drops steadily. Words are exchanged, whispers circulate. The king's inner circle begins to sense that Philotas is living on borrowed time. In 330 BC, far from home, a soldier named Dimnus is accused of conspiring to assassinate Alexander. According to the surviving accounts, another soldier learns of the plot and brings it to Philotas. For reasons that will never be fully understood, Philotas does not rush the information to the king. Perhaps he dismisses it as gossip. Perhaps he is exhausted. Perhaps he simply misjudges the moment. That single hesitation will be the last mistake he ever makes. When Alexander discovers that Philotas held this information for even a day, the reaction is volcanic. On the surface, the charge is simple. You learned of a conspiracy against your king, and you stayed silent. In the atmosphere of suspicion Alexander has spent years cultivating, that silence is indistinguishable from guilt. But beneath the surface, this is a strategic strike. Philotas is the son of the one man whose influence could rival the king's. Destroying the son is the first step in dismantling the father. Philotas is seized and dragged before the assembled army. Officers who shared cups with him the week before now stand in line to condemn him, because they understand with perfect clarity that defending him means joining him. Under torture, and every ancient source confirms he is tortured, Philotas produces a confession and reportedly names his own father as part of the conspiracy. How much of this is real is unknowable. A confession extracted under agony would be thrown out of any modern courtroom on earth. In Alexander's court, it is a death warrant. Philotas is executed. The sources disagree on exactly how, but the conclusion is the same. The commander of the most elite cavalry unit in the known world dies branded a traitor, his reputation shredded, his body discarded by the army he once led into battle. Alexander has eliminated one pillar of potential opposition, but the larger pillar still stands. Parmenion is alive, and Parmenion is not at court. He is stationed far away in Ecbatana, deep in what is now Iran, guarding the imperial treasury and the supply lines that keep the entire invasion functioning. He has no idea his son has been arrested, no idea that a confession bearing his name has been beaten out of a dying man. If Alexander summons him, the old general will arrive with questions. He might arrive with demands. He might arrive with enough loyalty among the troops to cause real problems. Alexander will not allow that possibility to breathe. So he does something that stands out as monstrous even by the savage standards of his era. He writes secret letters to the officers stationed alongside Parmenion, men who owe their careers to Alexander's favor and will not dare refuse a direct command. The letters contain a single instruction: kill Parmenion immediately. Not detain, not question. Kill. The messengers ride hard for Ecbatana. By the time they arrive, Philotas is already in the ground. Parmenion has never heard a charge. He has never seen a piece of evidence. He has never been permitted to speak one word in his own defense. The officers approach the old general during what appears to be routine business. Parmenion is roughly 70 years old. He has given his entire adult life to the Macedonian throne, first to Philip, then to the son he helped crown. He has served this dynasty longer than Alexander has been alive. None of that matters. At a signal, the men around him draw their weapons. He is cut down in his own headquarters, murdered by subordinates, with no trial, no hearing, and no warning. No court, no evidence weighed, just sealed letters and a coordinated assassination. The shock wave that travels through the army after this is not grief. It is raw, paralyzing fear. If Parmenion, the most senior and most loyal general in the empire, can be slaughtered without so much as a conversation, then no living person is beyond reach. Officers who have known Alexander since he was a child now understand a new truth with absolute clarity. Past service does not protect you. The king can fabricate a charge against your son, torture him until he says your name, and have you butchered in a foreign city thousands of miles from home without ever looking you in the eye. This is how a cult of fear operates. It atomizes everyone. It teaches each individual that he stands utterly alone, that no friendship, no blood tie, no lifetime of proven loyalty can serve as a shield. The only path to survival is total, unquestioning obedience. You do not comment on how much the king is drinking. You do not wonder aloud whether the army has been pushed too far east. You do not flinch when he wraps himself in Persian robes and demands honors that belong to the gods. You nod, you applaud, you press your face to the floor, and you pray he never fixes his gaze on you the way he fixed it on Philotas. If you have made it this far without skipping ahead, you are exactly the kind of viewer this channel was built for. We created a members-only community around this project called The Lineage. It is for people who do not just consume history passively, but feel a personal responsibility to keep it alive, unfiltered, and unflinching. When you join, you are not donating to a content creator. You are stepping into the small circle of people who make it possible for us to dig through ancient sources, verify every claim, and produce investigations like this one at the level they deserve. Members get early access to new episodes and exclusive material, but the real value is belonging. You become part of this. If that resonates, hit the join button and take your place in the lineage. Because after Parmenion's murder, there is no turning back. Alexander has severed the last link to his father's generation. He has proven to his army that he will annihilate even his most devoted servant the instant that servant feels like a risk. Every restraint is gone. Every check on his power has been removed by force. From this moment forward, No voice in his empire is loud enough to stop him when his fury turns outward. And if this is what he does to the general who handed him his earliest victories, wait until you see what he unleashes on entire cities that dare to stand in his way. The bodies that dropped close to Alexander served as warnings. The bodies that dropped far from him served as announcements. Once he had demonstrated to his own officers that absolutely no one was exempt from destruction, he aimed that same principle outward. Cities stopped being military objectives. They became public executions performed for the benefit of every settlement watching from the horizon. Resistance did not just mean defeat, it meant annihilation. That is exactly what happened at Gaza. After the nightmare at Tyre, most coastal cities did the math and surrendered. They threw open their gates, handed over prisoners, and prayed for survival. Gaza refused. It controlled a critical corridor linking Egypt to the rest of the Near East, perched on elevated ground behind thick fortifications, defended by a garrison that had watched Tyre burn and still chose to fight. Commanding the defense was Battus, a eunuch officer fiercely loyal to the Persian crown. Battus was not royalty. He was not some legendary warrior from the old epics. He was a professional soldier, handed a fortress and a simple mission: do not let it fall. When Alexander arrived and demanded the gates be opened, Battus said no. He did not hurl insults. He did not make grand declarations. He simply refused to bend. For Alexander, that was unforgivable. What followed was a siege defined by frustration and blood. Gaza's elevation turned every direct assault into a slaughter. Alexander's first attempt to scale the walls collapsed. Multiple sources report he took wounds from defenders firing down into his ranks. Consider what that did to his ego. This was the conqueror who had routed the great king of Persia on an open plain. Now, unnamed garrison soldiers in a regional stronghold were putting arrows through his armor in front of his entire army. Any rational commander could have sealed Gaza off, starved it, and marched south into Egypt without losing another man. But Alexander's campaigns were never purely about territory. They were about reputation and dread. If one fortress could stare him down and live, every fortress behind it would try the same thing. So he escalated. He ordered massive earthworks and siege ramps built to match the height of the walls. The fighting ground on week after week. The dead piled up. And every day that Gaza held, Alexander's fury deepened. When the walls finally broke, there was no negotiation. There was retribution. The male defenders were cut down. Women and children were dragged off into slavery. The population was uprooted and scattered. But Alexander reserved his most personal cruelty for Battus. The commander was hauled before him alive, bound and bleeding. Alexander demanded that he speak. Battus said nothing. He would not grovel. That silence was an act of war in Alexander's mind. It robbed him of the spectacle he craved, the sight of a defiant man shattering under the weight of his power. So Alexander reached into the mythology he carried like scripture. Homer had written of Achilles binding the corpse of Hector to a chariot and dragging it around the walls of Troy. Alexander had worshipped that story since childhood. He believed he was Achilles reborn, but Achilles at least had the decency to desecrate a dead body. Alexander had a living, breathing man. The ancient sources describe what came next. Ropes were threaded through holes pierced in Battus's ankles. He was lashed to the back of a chariot, and then the chariot was driven around the perimeter of the ruined city. Skin shredded against stone, flesh peeled away in ribbons, dust and blood mixed into something unrecognizable. This served no military purpose. It fed no soldier, secured no supply line, advanced no frontier. It was theatrical savagery, a king performing mythology on a human canvas because a single man had refused to kneel. The pattern here is what matters. One garrison commander declined to submit. One fortress dented his pride. The response was the obliteration of an entire community and a ritualized killing designed to echo sacred legend. Now, multiply that pattern across dozens of cities, hundreds of settlements, and you begin to understand why entire regions of the ancient Near East were permanently altered after his army passed through. His rage did not stop at stone walls. It reached forward into generations. Some of his most disturbing orders were not even directed at active enemies. They targeted people whose only offense was a family tree. That is the story of the Branchidae. Long before Alexander was born, during the earlier clashes between Greece and Persia, a sacred temple stood at Didyma, near the city of Miletus, tended by a priestly clan called the Branchidae. Greek tradition held that when the Persian king Xerxes invaded, these priests betrayed their own sanctuary, surrendering its treasures to the enemy. In exchange, they were given safe passage and resettled under Persian protection deep in Central Asia, far from anyone who might hold them accountable. By the time Alexander's army marched through that distant region, roughly a century and a half had passed. The people living in that settlement were not the priests who had committed the original betrayal. They were descendants separated by 5 or 6 generations, born under Persian rule, in a village their ancestors had been ordered to inhabit. They had never set foot near Didyma. They had never seen the temple. Yet when Alexander's column appeared on the horizon, they came out to greet him with open arms. They still spoke Greek. They saw in this young conqueror a miraculous link back to a homeland they had only heard about in old family stories. Alexander received them warmly. He spoke with them. He confirmed who they were and where they had come from. They must have believed their exile was finally over. Then he made a decision that reveals the frozen core of his thinking. Instead of resettling them, instead of granting them land or citizenship, he declared them a contamination that had to be eliminated. Not the original traitors, who had been dead for over 100 years, their children's children's children. Every last one. He ordered his soldiers into the settlement. Men, women, children, all killed without distinction. Homes were torn apart and set ablaze. The village was scraped from the earth. He then reportedly had the surrounding trees felled and the land stripped bare, as though he wanted even the ground itself to forget that anyone had lived there. All of this because of a transgression committed by people who had been dust in the ground for generations before these victims were born. This was not a battlefield decision. It was a doctrine. Guilt is hereditary, and punishment has no expiration. It reveals the architecture of his mind. Time did not soften his grievances. Distance did not weaken his reach. If your ancestors had offended his sense of Greek honor, you could be executed for it 150 years after the fact. This is what separates him from a conventional conqueror and places him in the territory of something far more disturbing, a figure driven not by strategy, but by an obsessive need to purify the world according to his own mythological scorecard. Every one of these atrocities added another coat of terror to his reputation. It was no longer enough for cities to open their gates. Their leaders now had to calculate whether a decision made by their great-grandfather might suddenly be revisited by a king who treated the past like a personal ledger of debts still owed. Then came Persepolis. Persepolis was not simply another conquest. It was the ceremonial heart of the Persian Empire, a sprawling complex of palaces, audience halls, and treasury vaults constructed over generations as a monument to imperial grandeur. Carved reliefs of subject nations lined the stairways. Towering columns held up roofs inlaid with precious metals. The entire site existed to communicate one message to every visitor who climbed its steps. This empire is eternal. Alexander took it without a prolonged fight. The royal treasury fell into his hands, and the ancient sources describe staggering quantities of gold and silver seized in a single day. Had he simply claimed the wealth and preserved the complex, Persepolis would have become the crown jewel of his new dominion. Instead, he chose to send a very different signal. First, he unleashed his troops to loot. That alone was devastating, but it was standard practice in ancient warfare. The true catastrophe came later, during a night of heavy drinking. Alexander and his senior companions were deep into their cups when the conversation turned to vengeance. Persia had burned Greek temples decades earlier, including the sacred buildings on the Athenian Acropolis. Among the revelers was a woman named Thais, companion to one of Alexander's generals. Whether out of genuine fury or the recklessness of wine, she urged Alexander to put Persepolis to the torch as payback for Athens. The ancient accounts disagree on the precise sequence, but they converge on the result. Someone seized a torch, flames caught fabric and timber, and within minutes, the greatest architectural achievement of the Persian world was burning. Fire raced through wooden ceilings. Columns that had stood for a century glowed orange against the night sky. Any sober voice that might have argued for restraint was swallowed by the roar of flames and drunken cheering. Alexander may have regretted it afterward, if we trust certain historians. Some sources suggest that when he saw the scale of the destruction in daylight, he recognized that he had incinerated something genuinely magnificent. But regret does not reverse fire. Generations of accumulated art, administrative records, and symbolically potent architecture vanished in a single night of intoxicated spite. He could have transformed Persepolis into proof that he honored the civilizations he absorbed. He could have crowned himself in its halls and ruled from its throne. Instead, he turned it into a charred monument to his own volatility. That was the fundamental contradiction of his empire. Even as he styled himself as a bridge between East and West, there was always a scene like Persepolis, smoldering in the background, where impulse overwhelmed reason and entire civilizations absorbed the cost. Line up Gaza, the Branchidae massacre, and the incineration of Persepolis, and an unmistakable pattern emerges. Alexander did not merely defeat his opponents, he deleted them. He punished not only resistance, but the memory of resistance. He weaponized myth to sanctify brutality and ransacked history to justify murder. In his own mind, none of this was criminal. It was destiny being enforced according to a script only he could read. His court historians and the Romantic writers who followed centuries later would celebrate the cities he founded, the cultural fusion he attempted, the trade routes he cracked open. Those achievements were real. He did plant Greek-speaking communities across vast stretches of conquered land. He did weave Persian customs into his court. But it is dishonest to praise this blending without acknowledging the people who were ground into nothing to make space for it. For every new Alexandria raised from the sand, there was an older settlement reduced to cinders. For every speech about harmony between peoples, there was a community like the Branchidae, exterminated because a young king could not tolerate an ancestral stain on his nation's pride, even after the stain was older than anyone alive. For every famous act of generosity, like his treatment of the captured Persian royal family, there was a Gaza or a Persepolis, where generosity lost to vindictiveness, and the world was poorer for it. And what about the soldiers watching all of this unfold? Consider what it meant to be a Macedonian infantryman, witnessing your king inflict on strangers the same merciless violence he had already inflicted on friends. When he tortured Philotas, had Parmenion assassinated by letter, and forced his companions to grovel on the floor before him, they learned that rank and years of service meant nothing. When they then watched him erase entire populations, they absorbed an even darker lesson. His fury had no ceiling. If he could annihilate a village of fellow Greeks over a betrayal none of them had committed, what would stop him from annihilating a battalion of Macedonians for a present-day act of defiance? The further east he pushed, the more his army transformed from a fighting force into a traveling engine of dread, terrifying not just to the people in its path, but to the men marching inside its ranks. The atrocities became impossible to rationalize. Supply lines stretched to the breaking point. Veterans who had left Macedon as young men were now aging in foreign dust. They watched cities stormed, torched, repopulated with strangers. They watched captives chained and marched away. They watched their king sink deeper each year into the belief that he was something more than human. Yet even in the middle of this relentless violence, something paradoxical was unfolding. Alexander was also accumulating, not just gold, but manuscripts, artifacts, specimens, and knowledge from every culture he devoured. He dispatched reports and collected objects back to Greece. He kept philosophers and scholars within arm's reach at all times. This dual nature is precisely why his legend would later be polished to such a blinding shine. The same campaigns that produced mass graves also produced the records that allowed future writers to reshape him into a figure of cosmic destiny. And if you find yourself wondering how any of this survived 23 centuries to reach your screen, how the letters, the battlefield accounts, the fragments of lost histories were pieced together, this is the right moment to mention something. The primary source we built the backbone of this episode around is not casual reading. It is a dense, unrelenting volume, an exhaustive archive of the violence and political machinery behind Alexander's march. And you can get your hands on it right now. If you tap the View Products button on your screen, you will find it at the top of the shelf. This is the foundational text for everything you have heard today, the book that connects the sieges, the massacres, the court purges, and the slow disintegration of a mind given absolute power. If you want to go deeper than this video can take you and engage directly with the ancient accounts, this belongs on your shelf. You will also notice that we have stocked that same page with a curated set of themed items tied to this darker chapter of antiquity. I will not spoil the specifics because the collection rotates, but these are not generic merchandise. They are the kind of immersive pieces that make you feel like you are holding a fragment of the world we have been walking through. And alongside those items, you will find our official reading list, essential dark history books you should own. Line those volumes up, and you have a personal library covering the most brutal and most revealing episodes in human history. Open the Shop tab, browse while you listen, and start building your collection. The video is not going anywhere, because as Alexander's trail of destruction against cities and civilizations grew longer, something inside his army finally cracked. It did not happen at Gaza. It did not happen at Persepolis. It happened much further east, after more years of relentless campaigning, more battles, more hollow promises that once the next enemy fell, they would finally turn toward home. He drove his men through the mountains and valleys of Bactria and Sogdiana, hunted insurgents through terrain that swallowed entire units, married local aristocrats into his inner circle to cement control, and then turned his gaze toward India. The fighting there was unlike anything the Macedonians had experienced. War elephants smashed into their formations. The monsoon climate rotted leather and rusted iron. Rivers wider than anything in Greece blocked their path. Casualties climbed at a pace that made veterans openly question whether survival was still possible. At the Hyphasis River, at the outermost edge of the known world, the senior officers came to Alexander and delivered a message from the ranks. The army was finished. They would not take another step east. They wanted to see their families, their homes, their own sky one more time before disease or exhaustion or some nameless battle in an unknown land took them permanently. This was not a minor grievance. This was a collective refusal from tens of thousands of men who had followed him through every conceivable horror for the better part of a decade. Alexander tried everything in his arsenal. He pleaded. He raged. He invoked their shared glory. He retreated into his tent for days, waiting for guilt or loyalty to change their minds. It did not work. For the first time in his life, his army told him no, and the no held. He agreed to turn back. But if you believe that meant forgiveness, you have not been paying attention to how this man operates. He would never absolve them for that moment. A cult leader cannot process the idea that his followers have a breaking point. A king who genuinely believes he is divine cannot accept that mortals get to set the boundaries. So he made a decision that would cost thousands of lives. The road home would not be a reward. It would be a reckoning. Not every man who had demanded to leave would live long enough to walk through his own front door. Alexander would teach them what it cost to tell a god they had had enough. The route he selected was not the safest available. It was not the most efficient. It carved directly through one of the most merciless landscapes in the ancient world, the Gedrosian Desert. He knew its reputation. He knew that previous armies had been swallowed whole by its heat and emptiness. He led them into it anyway. The same king who had erased cities from the map was now prepared to spend his own soldiers' lives as currency in a lesson about obedience. In the next chapter, we walk into that scorching void alongside them and witness what happens when the cult of Alexander finally collides with a force that cannot be conquered, broken, or dragged behind a chariot. The desert had no interest in glory. It did not recognize titles, did not bow to conquerors, and could not be intimidated by reputation. It understood only two things: water and shade. Alexander chose to march tens of thousands of human beings directly into a landscape that offered neither, for no reason beyond proving that he could. After the mutiny at the Hyphasis River in 326 BC, his army had spoken with one voice, not one step further east. These were not green recruits trembling on their first campaign. Many had been with him since the day he crossed into Asia. They were weathered, broken men carrying more scars than memories of home. When they said they were done, there was no bluff behind it. Alexander accepted their refusal publicly. He announced the army would reverse course. Sacrifices were offered. The ranks erupted in relief. To anyone watching, it looked like sanity had won. But something inside Alexander fractured that day. His followers, the men who were supposed to obey without question, had drawn a line. They had forced him to confront the one truth he could never accept, that he was bound by the same human limitations as every man around him. He could not execute an entire army the way he had executed Philotas. So he found another way to punish them. He chose the route home. Safer roads existed. He could have retraced the path they had already carved east, through territory they controlled, with established supply lines. He could have split the column, sent the families and baggage trains along a secure corridor, while he took a smaller force on a more ambitious route. Instead, he ordered a massive portion of the army and its trailing population of civilians directly into Gdrosia, a stretch of earth corresponding roughly to the coastal wastelands of modern southern Iran and Pakistan. Ancient writers describe it in terms that sound like a curse. Endless sand, killing heat, and soil so hostile that even the people born there barely survived. Alexander had heard the warnings. He had intelligence reports. He knew that this route had swallowed smaller parties whole. He did not alter his decision. In his mind, the crossing was precisely the kind of feat that would confirm his place among legends. To the thousands of people dragging themselves behind him, it became a sentence of death, delivered without trial. The march started with something resembling order. Rations were distributed, pack animals were loaded. Women, children, camp workers, and merchants gathered their belongings and fell into line, trusting that the man who had never lost a battle understood what he was leading them into. The first days were punishing, but survivable. Then the supplies began to disappear. In Gdrosia, water was not a resource. It was the difference between breathing and not breathing. Streams marked on rough maps had dried to cracked mud. Wells were spaced further apart than anyone had calculated, or had already been drained by advance parties. The sun did not simply beat down. It radiated upward from the rock and sand, turning the ground itself into a furnace. Soldiers began hiding their water from each other. Fights broke out between units over a mouthful. The slowest and the weakest stopped walking and never started again. The ancient sources describe what unfolded next in language that reads like the end of the world. People collapsing mid-stride and being left where they fell. Pack animals folding at the knees and dying under their loads. Men clawing at the earth with raw fingers, desperate for any trace of moisture beneath the surface. Mothers stumbling forward with children, whose lips had split open and turned the color of chalk. Every mile the column advanced, it left behind a trail of the dead and the dying. One account preserves a moment that has been debated for centuries. A small scouting party managed to locate a trickle of water and filled a helmet to bring back to Alexander. The men surrounding him watched with cracked, bleeding mouths as he held it up. Then he turned the helmet over and poured every drop into the sand. He declared that he would not drink what his soldiers could not share. Some have called this an act of extraordinary solidarity. Others have called it performance art by a man who valued symbolism more than survival. Either way, the water was gone. The thirst remained. Whatever his motives, the outcome is beyond dispute. Thousands perished. Ancient historians disagree on exact figures, and modern scholars cannot reconcile the estimates, but every source acknowledges that the losses were devastating. And it was not only soldiers who died. It was the vast civilian population that had trailed the army for years, the traders, the craftsmen, the servants, the wives, the children. These people had staked their survival on proximity to Alexander. Gdrosia proved that proximity to Alexander was itself a death sentence. Follow any cult far enough, and you reach the moment when the leader watches his own people die and calls it necessary. Gdrosia was that moment. When Alexander finally led the ragged survivors out of the wasteland and into regions where food and water existed again, he had accomplished something profoundly dark. The men and women who emerged were his completely. They had watched people beside them drop dead and still kept walking. They had cursed his name under their breath and still followed his orders. He had destroyed their bodies and retained their obedience, or at the very least, their terror. When he reached civilization, his response was not humility. He sent dispatches ahead boasting that he had succeeded where even the great Persian kings had failed, crossing a region that history said could not be crossed. He repackaged the catastrophe as a triumph. The dead became acceptable overhead in the construction of his personal mythology. And even after all of this, he was not finished bending the world to match the shape inside his head. If Gdrosia revealed how little he cared about the physical survival of his followers, what came next revealed how little he respected the most intimate corners of their lives. In 324 BC, Alexander arrived at the city of Susa, one of the ancient seats of Persian royal power. And there, he orchestrated one of the most unsettling spectacles of his entire reign: the mass weddings. By this point, he had already married Roxana of Bactria, a union rooted in political calculation dressed up as romance. At Susa, he pushed far beyond that. He decided that the only way to permanently fuse his conquered empire together was not through shared laws or shared governance, but through shared bloodlines. It was not enough for Macedonians and Persians to serve in the same administration. He wanted them to produce the same children. He ordered a massive wedding ceremony. The ancient sources record that approximately 10,000 Macedonian soldiers were paired with Persian women drawn from noble families across the former empire. Alexander himself took 2 additional wives that day: Statira, daughter of the defeated Darius III, and Parysatis, daughter of the earlier king Artaxerxes III. His senior commanders were assigned brides from Persia's most elite bloodlines. Rows upon rows of couples sat together in an arrangement that looked less like a celebration and more like a military formation of human beings. Framed one way, this could sound like visionary statesmanship. 2 civilizations joined at the root, a new ruling class carrying the heritage of both worlds. But consider it from the ground level, from the perspective of the ordinary soldiers sitting in those rows. Many of them already had wives waiting in Macedon. They had not pursued these women. They had not chosen these unions. They had been told, "Here is your new wife. Take her." It was not a wedding. It was an assignment. Alexander covered the costs. He provided lavish dowries. There was feasting and music and elaborate ceremony. But strip away the pageantry, and the core transaction is naked. The king was using his soldiers' private lives as instruments of policy. He did not see them as individual men with existing commitments, with women they loved, with children growing up without them on the other side of the world. He saw them as genetic raw material for a new generation of subjects whose very identity would be owed to him. Some men may have accepted it willingly, even eagerly. A high-born Persian bride came with wealth and status. But beneath the surface, resentment was festering. These soldiers were being forced into marriages with women from a civilization they had spent a decade being told to conquer, while their real families aged in silence an entire continent away, never knowing if their husbands and fathers were alive or dead. This is why the language of a death cult fits. Not because every person in his orbit literally worshipped him as a god at every moment, but because he operated under the absolute conviction that he had the right to determine who lived, who died, who married whom, and whose children would inherit the earth. He believed he could redesign human relationships the way an architect redesigns a building. That is how totalitarian minds function. They do not see citizens or soldiers. They see components to be arranged. After Susa, he took yet another step that ignited fury among his Macedonian veterans. He began recruiting massive numbers of young men from the conquered territories, drilling them in Macedonian combat techniques and integrating them into his frontline forces. He gave some of them the title epigoni, meaning the successors, the ones who come after. The implication was unmistakable. These Eastern soldiers would eventually replace the aging Macedonians and anchor Alexander's control over Asia with troops who had no homeland pulling them westward. The veterans understood exactly what they were looking at. They were being phased out. They had bled their way from the Balkans to the banks of Indian rivers, and now the king was building a replacement army designed to be more compliant, less connected to the traditions of Philip's generation, and entirely dependent on Alexander for its identity. The tension reached its peak at Opus, near the Tigris River, when Alexander announced that older veterans would be honorably discharged and sent home while Eastern troops assumed their roles. The camp erupted. Macedonian soldiers shouted that he had abandoned them, that he loved his so-called barbarian recruits more than the men who had made his empire possible. They demanded he send away his foreign advisors and remember who had carried him to glory. Alexander's response was volcanic. He leapt from his seat and tore into them with a speech that swung between wounded pride and naked intimidation. He catalogued every territory he had conquered, every treasure he had won them, every battle where he had stood in the front rank and bled alongside them. He told them that without him, they were nothing, that he had found them as shepherds and made them masters of the world. And then he did what he always did when his authority was questioned. He turned to violence. He pointed at the soldiers he identified as ringleaders and ordered them seized and killed on the spot. Men were dragged from the crowd and executed in full view of the army. Blood soaked into the dirt, while thousands of soldiers stood frozen, watching their comrades die for the crime of speaking honestly. Once the terror had settled over the ranks like smoke, Alexander shifted his tone. He staged a reconciliation. Tears were shed. Embraces were exchanged. Oaths of loyalty were renewed. All of it performed in the shadow of fresh corpses still cooling on the ground. This was the cadence of his entire reign. Horror followed by theater. Punishment followed by speeches about brotherhood. It held his empire together for exactly as long as he was alive and upright. The instant his body failed, everything he had constructed began to fracture. In 323 BC, Alexander returned to Babylon. He was approximately 32 years old. In barely more than a decade, he had obliterated the Persian Empire, founded cities across 3 continents, and transformed his army into an extension of his own will. But retirement was a concept that did not exist in his vocabulary. Babylon became the staging ground for the next wave of conquests. He drew up invasion plans for Arabia. He studied maps of territories beyond that. He discussed colossal engineering projects, new naval fleets, potential campaigns into the Western Mediterranean. Inside his mind, the story was still accelerating. Then his body betrayed him. Following a stretch of heavy feasting and drinking, one banquet in particular at the home of a companion named Medius is cited repeatedly in the sources. Alexander fell ill. The ancient accounts describe the symptoms with slight variations but a consistent arc. High fever, escalating pain, progressive weakness. Over the course of several days, he lost the ability to walk, then to sit, then to speak clearly. The man who had personally led cavalry charges into the teeth of enemy formations could no longer lift himself from a bed without help. In the ancient world, the illness of a king was never a private matter. It was a political earthquake. Rumors ignited immediately. Some whispered poison, pointing fingers at rivals within the court. Others believed the accumulated toll of years of combat, dozens of wounds, and relentless alcohol consumption had finally overwhelmed his body. Modern medical theories have suggested everything from typhoid fever to malaria to acute complications from old injuries worsened by chronic drinking. Certainty is impossible. What is certain is what his men witnessed. Their supposedly invincible leader reduced day by day to something fragile, powerless against an enemy that could not be outflanked or intimidated. As the days ground on and his condition deteriorated, his generals gathered around him. These were the same men who had watched him orchestrate the murder of Parmenion, extract a confession from Philotas under torture, execute soldiers at Opus for speaking out of turn, and drag a living man behind a chariot until he was unrecognizable. They understood with perfect clarity that if Alexander recovered, grudges would be settled. They also understood that if he died without naming an heir, every mile of his empire would become a killing field. Alexander had one son potentially on the way. Roxana was pregnant. He had a half-brother, Aridaeus, whose mental limitations made him incapable of independent rule. Neither option could hold an empire together by force of personality. The generals needed a directive, or failing that, a phrase ambiguous enough to justify whatever move each of them intended to make. According to the most famous version of the story, when someone asked the dying king to whom he left his empire, Alexander answered, "To the strongest." If those words were actually spoken, they were either the darkest joke in military history or a deliberate act of sabotage against the future. They told every powerful man in the room that the empire belonged to whoever was willing to fight the hardest and kill the most efficiently for it. Other versions record him whispering something about the most worthy, or saying nothing at all. What is beyond doubt is that he left behind no coherent plan, no named successor, and no mechanism for peaceful transition. One of the final scenes preserved by ancient writers carries a weight that centuries have not diminished. As Alexander lay unable to speak, he requested to be carried past his soldiers one last time. The men filed by his bed in a slow, silent procession, staring at the figure who had once seemed like a natural disaster given human form, now pale, drenched in sweat, barely able to track their faces with his eyes. Some called out to him, some wept openly, others simply stared, unable to reconcile the broken figure on the bed with the force that had reshaped their world. He managed to raise his hand, or nod slightly depending on the source, acknowledging each man as he passed. That faint gesture had to stand as a substitute for all the ferocious energy they had witnessed for over a decade. On roughly the 10th or 11th day of his illness, Alexander died in Babylon. He had not yet reached 33. There was no last stand on a battlefield, no heroic duel against a worthy opponent. There was a sweat-soaked bed, organs failing one by one, and a room packed with men who were already mentally partitioning his empire before his breathing stopped. What followed proved that his true final legacy was not an empire. It was chaos. In the vacuum left by his death, his generals moved with the speed of predators. Perdiccas, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Antigonus, Lysimachus, and others immediately began maneuvering. They declared that Aridaeus would reign as Philip III and that Roxana's child, if born male, would rule alongside him. They called themselves guardians of Alexander's bloodline. In truth, they were already drawing borders with swords. One of the most grotesque struggles was over Alexander's corpse. In the ancient world, possession of a dead leader's body meant possession of his symbolic authority. The original plan was to transport Alexander's remains back to Macedon, to the royal burial grounds where Philip II had been laid to rest. That plan never reached completion. The body was reportedly embalmed with extraordinary care, preserved using methods reserved for the most exalted figures. Some accounts describe it being placed in a coffin filled with honey or a similar preserving substance, both to halt decomposition and to signal unimaginable wealth. An elaborate funeral carriage was constructed, gilded and decorated, designed to carry the remains westward in a procession befitting a figure his followers had been taught to regard as half-divine. Ptolemy, one of Alexander's most trusted companions, and now the self-appointed ruler of Egypt, intercepted the funeral procession. He seized the body and redirected it south to the land he was claiming as his own kingdom. He understood precisely what he was doing. By taking custody of Alexander's remains, he was claiming custody of Alexander's legend. He was declaring himself the true inheritor of that aura of invincibility. The body was installed first in Memphis, and later transferred to a purpose-built tomb in the city of Alexandria. For centuries afterward, people traveled across the Mediterranean to stand in the presence of the corpse, to be near the physical shell of the man who had crushed the largest empire on earth. The irony could not cut deeper. Alexander had spent his entire life demanding that living men kneel before his living body, that they treat his physical presence as something approaching divine. Now his dead body became a trophy passed between ambitious men, a political prop in their own campaigns for worship and legitimacy. He had attempted to control the future through forced marriages, systematic massacres, and coerced oaths of loyalty. In the end, he could not control where his own remains were taken or who would claim to speak for his memory. The political aftermath was equally savage. The promise of a unified empire under one vision disintegrated almost before the funeral carriage left Babylon. For roughly 4 decades following his death, his former generals and their heirs waged a series of devastating conflicts that history now calls the Wars of the Successors. Alliances formed overnight and collapsed by morning. Former brothers in arms became mortal enemies. Cities that had already been besieged by Alexander were besieged again by the men who had once served him. Alexander IV, the son Roxana delivered after his father's death, was eventually murdered as a teenager, along with his mother. The entire direct bloodline of Alexander was systematically extinguished. This is the final, brutal punchline of his existence. He had ripped the known world apart, dismantled an empire that had stood for 2 centuries, marched his followers through deserts, forced them into marriages they never wanted, and slaughtered anyone who questioned his divinity, all to build a dynasty that did not survive a single generation beyond his own heartbeat. Every skull crushed, every library burned, every city erased, every man forced to his knees, and the future he tried to construct by force looked nothing like the vision inside his head. It belonged instead to men who had absorbed his capacity for ruthlessness, but discarded his supposed dream of a blended world. Today, textbooks and museum exhibits still label him Alexander the Great. Statues of him stand in public squares across multiple continents. Films portray him as a tragic visionary. But if you examine the record with open eyes, the pattern is undeniable. He did not govern like a philosopher king working toward a higher good. He governed like the leader of an armed cult that had seized control of the most powerful military machine on the planet. He murdered friends on the strength of a suspicion. He annihilated entire communities for crimes their ancestors committed generations before they were born. He marched his own people through a desert to punish them for daring to say no. He treated marriages as military orders and families as breeding programs. He died surrounded not by devoted subjects mourning a beloved leader, but by calculating men who smiled to his face while already mapping the wars they would wage over his corpse. So the next time someone invokes his glory, remember Gaza. Remember the Branchidae, wiped from the earth for a betrayal they never committed. Remember Persepolis, one of the great architectural wonders of the ancient world, reduced to charcoal because a drunk king wanted to impress a woman at a party. Remember the bodies strewn across Gdrosia and the forced weddings at Susa. Remember the boy born after his death, murdered as a teenager because men wanted the throne his father had soaked in blood. That is the real cost of the legend. That is the invoice history keeps trying to hide. If you have stayed with this story from beginning to end, thank you. It means you refuse to settle for the sanitized version of the past. Take a moment right now to subscribe, hit the like button, and send this video to someone who still believes Alexander was nothing more than a heroic conqueror. Help us drag more myths out of the shadows and into the light where they belong. On your screen right now, Another investigation is waiting. A full-length descent into a different chapter of dark history. Every bit as brutal and every bit as necessary. Click it and keep going. If you made it through Alexander's trail of bodies, you are ready for what comes next. You have just watched another premium documentary by Ancestral, your ultimate history hub on YouTube.